I've always loved hiking. There's just something about getting out into nature, away from the noise and stress of everyday life, that clears my head like nothing else. So, a few years ago, when I was feeling particularly stressed out with work and everything, I decided to take a solo hiking trip to this trail I'd heard about through a friend. It was supposed to be one of those hidden gems, beautiful scenery, not too crowded, the perfect place to escape for a day. It was early autumn, and the weather was just starting to cool down. The trees were turning that beautiful mix of red, orange, and yellow, and I couldn't wait to spend a day surrounded by all that. The trail was about an hour's drive from my place, out in this more rural area that I wasn't super familiar with, but I figured that was part of the adventure. I packed up my gear, just the essentials, water, snacks, a small first aid kit, and my phone, and headed out early in the morning. The drive out there was uneventful, just me and the winding roads through small towns and past farms. The further I got from the city, the more relaxed I felt, like I was leaving all my worries behind. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was around 8 a.m. There were only a couple of cars in the small dirt parking lot, which was exactly what I was hoping for. I wasn't in the mood to deal with crowds. I just wanted some peace and quiet. I grabbed my backpack, locked up the car, and started on the trail. The first part was pretty straightforward. A well-worn path through a dense forest, with the morning light filtering through the trees. The air was crisp, and I remember thinking how perfect the day was. I passed one or two other hikers on their way back, and we exchanged the usual nods and good mornings. But other than that, I was alone. After about an hour of hiking, the trail started to get a bit more rugged. It narrowed, and the trees grew closer together, making the path feel more secluded. I liked it though. It felt like I was really getting away from everything. I didn't have a specific destination in mind, just planned to hike until I found a good spot to sit and take it all in. As I went deeper into the forest, I noticed it was getting quieter. The birds that had been chirping earlier seemed to have disappeared, and all I could hear was the sound of my own footsteps on the leaves. It was one of those silences that's almost too quiet, where you start to notice every little sound you make. But I told myself it was just the natural calm of being in the woods, away from the city noise. After another half hour or so, I came across a small clearing. It wasn't marked on the trail map, but it looked like a nice place to take a break. The trees opened up to a patch of grass, with a few large rocks scattered around that looked perfect for sitting. There was even a small stream running along the edge of the clearing, the water clear and cold. I figured this was as good a place as any to stop for a while. I took off my backpack, sat down on one of the rocks, and pulled out my water bottle. The sun was shining through the trees, and I felt this overwhelming sense of peace. It was exactly what I needed, a quiet spot in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but nature around me. But as I sat there, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on right away, just this nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. At first I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I found myself glancing around the clearing, looking for something, anything, that could explain why I suddenly felt so uneasy. That's when I noticed the trees on the far side of the clearing. They were different somehow, darker, almost as if they were casting longer shadows than the ones around me. I know it sounds strange, but it was like that part of the forest was somehow thicker, denser. And the more I looked at it, the more I felt like something was watching me from within those trees. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling only grew stronger. I couldn't see anything in the trees, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something or someone was out there, hidden just beyond my sight. My heart started to beat a little faster, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that comes with anxiety. I didn't want to let it ruin my day though, so I forced myself to take a few deep breaths and relax. But then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, coming from the direction of those darker trees. It wasn't loud, just a slight movement, like something was brushing against the leaves. I froze, my senses suddenly on high alert. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was dead silent again. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or a rabbit maybe, but the unease wouldn't go away. I strained my ears, listening for any other sounds, but all I could hear was the distant trickle of the stream and the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the wind. I couldn't explain why, but something about that rustling didn't feel right. It felt deliberate, like someone or something was trying to stay hidden. I decided it was time to move. I packed up my things quickly, my hands trembling slightly as I shoved my water bottle back into my backpack. I didn't want to panic, but the thought of staying in that clearing any longer was making my skin crawl. I stood up, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started walking back toward the trail. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the darkened trees one last time, and that's when I saw it. A figure, just barely visible through the branches. It was standing there, motionless, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was a person, but something about the way they were standing, the way they were just there, made every hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I turned and started walking down the trail, my pace quicker than before. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see if they were following me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but nothing added up. Who would be out here, hiding in the trees, watching me? And why? The further I got from the clearing, the more the unease grew. I knew I needed to get back to the main trail, to where other hikers might be, but the path seemed to stretch on forever. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump, and I kept imagining that figure appearing around the next bend in the trail. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I made it back to the main trail. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down. I just kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't until I reached the parking lot and saw my car that I finally let myself breathe. There were a few more cars in the lot now, and the sight of other people, even if they were strangers, brought me some comfort. But the unease didn't leave me, even as I got into my car and started the drive home. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure following me, but there was nothing. Just the empty road and the fading light of the late afternoon. When I got home, I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just my imagination, that I let the isolation of the woods get to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I'd seen something, someone out there, and the way they were watching me wasn't normal. It wasn't the curiosity of a fellow hiker or the harmless presence of someone enjoying the woods. It was something else. Something that made my skin crawl just thinking about it. I didn't go hiking alone after that. Whenever I got the urge to hit the trails, I made sure to bring a friend along. I didn't want to risk another encounter like that one. Didn't want to feel that same gnawing fear that had followed me out of the woods that day. To this day, I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm out in nature. I love hiking, but there's a part of me that can't shake the memory of that figure in the trees, the feeling that I was being watched. It's like a shadow that lingers in the back of my mind, reminding me that there are things out there, people maybe, that we don't understand, things that can make even the most peaceful place feel threatening in an instant. So now, whenever I go hiking, I'm always a little more aware of my surroundings, always listening for those small, almost imperceptible sounds that might mean something more. Because once you've had that kind of experience, it changes the way you see the world, the way you feel when you're out there, alone in the wilderness. It makes you realize that sometimes the scariest things aren't what you can see, they're what you can't see, what's hiding just out of sight, waiting for you to let your guard down. And that's a lesson I don't think I'll ever forget. A few years back, I had this experience while hiking that I still think about, especially when I'm out on the trails alone. It wasn't one of those over-the-top, life-threatening situations, but it was enough to make me rethink a lot of things about solo hiking. It's the kind of story that I usually keep to myself because, honestly, it still gives me the creeps. So, it was early spring, and I was itching to get outside after being cooped up all winter. The weather had finally started to warm up, and I figured it was the perfect time to hit one of the local trails. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being out in nature that just clears my head. This particular trail wasn't too far from where I live, maybe about an hour's drive. It wasn't a super popular spot, which was perfect for me because I wanted some peace and quiet, just me and the trees. I left early in the morning, wanting to make the most of the day. The drive out was uneventful, just the usual winding roads through small towns and farmland. By the time I got to the trailhead, it was around 8 a.m., and the parking lot was empty except for one other car. I remember thinking how great it was that I'd have the trail mostly to myself. I grabbed my backpack, which had all the essentials: water, snacks, a map, my phone, and a small first aid kit, and started out on the trail. The first part of the hike was exactly what I needed. The trail was well marked and wound through a dense forest. The air was cool and fresh, and I felt this sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a while. There's something about being surrounded by nature that just puts everything else in perspective. About an hour into the hike, I came across a fork in the trail. One path led deeper into the forest, while the other seemed to head up toward a ridge. I decided to take the path that led into the forest, figuring I'd save the ridge for later. As I went further in, the trees started to get thicker, and the trail narrowed. It wasn't anything too intense, but it definitely felt more secluded, like I was leaving the rest of the world behind. After another half hour of hiking, I reached a small clearing. It wasn't marked on the map, but it looked like a nice spot to take a break. There was a fallen log that made for a perfect seat, and the clearing was surrounded by tall pines that blocked out most of the sun, giving the place a cool, almost eerie vibe. I sat down, took a sip of water, and just soaked in the quiet. It was that kind of silence you only get in the woods, where the only sounds are the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. But as I sat there, I started to feel this weird sense of unease. At first I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the fact that I was alone in the middle of nowhere. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like the air had changed, gotten heavier somehow, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I looked around the clearing, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but everything felt off. The trees seemed darker, the shadows longer, and the silence that I'd found so peaceful just a few minutes ago now felt oppressive, almost like it was pressing down on me. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination run wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the trees behind me. It wasn't loud, just enough to catch my attention. I froze, my heart starting to race as I listened. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was dead silent again. I turned slowly, half expecting to see a deer or some other animal, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I stood up, trying to stay calm, but my nerves were shot. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched had only gotten stronger. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get out of there as fast as I could. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking back toward the trail. As I headed back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that I was going to see someone, or something, following me. But there was nothing, just the trees and that same oppressive silence. I picked up the pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I was being hunted, like something was out there, hidden in the trees, watching my every move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I made it back to the fork in the trail. I didn't stop, didn't even look back. I just kept moving, wanting to put as much distance between me and that clearing as possible. The feeling of unease stayed with me though, even as I got back onto the more familiar part of the trail. It was like a shadow that I couldn't shake, this constant sense of dread that followed me all the way back to the parking lot. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was relieved to see that other car still there. I wasn't sure if it was the same one I'd seen earlier, but knowing there was someone else around made me feel a little better. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, and my heart was still racing, but I told myself it was over, that I was safe now. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, eager to leave that place behind. But as I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The rational part of my brain kept telling me it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I knew something had been out there, watching me, waiting. When I got home, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just a fluke, a weird moment that didn't mean anything, but that feeling of unease stuck with me, lingering in the back of my mind like a bad dream that I couldn't shake. A few days later, I was talking to a friend of mine who's really into hiking. I mentioned the trail I'd been on, and he got this weird look on his face. He asked me if I'd heard about the stories from that area, and when I said no, he told me that there had been a few strange incidents on that trail over the years. People going missing, hikers finding abandoned campsites, things like that. He said it was probably just rumors, but the way he said it made me think he believed there was more to it. Hearing that didn't exactly help me feel any better. In fact, it made everything I'd experienced on the trail feel even more real, more sinister. I started to wonder if maybe I hadn't just imagined it, if maybe there really was something or someone out there, hidden in the trees, watching and waiting. Since then, I've been a lot more cautious about where I go hiking, especially when I'm alone. I still love being out in nature, but that experience changed the way I see the woods. What used to feel like a peaceful escape now sometimes feels like a place where you can't quite trust your surroundings, where you have to stay on your guard. I haven't been back to that trail since, and I'm not sure I ever will. There's just something about it that doesn't sit right with me, something that makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. Maybe it's just paranoia, or maybe it's my instincts trying to tell me to stay away. Either way, I've learned to listen to that little voice in the back of my head, the one that tells me when something's not right. Because out there in the woods, where it's just you and the trees, it's easy to forget that you're not always alone. And sometimes the things you can't see are the ones you need to worry about the most. So yeah, that's my story. It might not be the most dramatic or terrifying, but it's real, and it's stuck with me ever since. And if nothing else, it's a reminder that even in the places where you feel safest, you can still find yourself in situations that make you question everything you thought you knew. Alright, here's something that happened to me a couple of years ago that still gives me the creeps when I think about it. It was a hiking trip, just like any other, but it ended up being one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. I've always been into hiking. There's something about being out in nature, away from everything, that really clears my head. I try to get out on the trails as often as I can, especially when I'm feeling stressed. It's like therapy for me, you know? So this one weekend, I decided to head out to a trail I hadn't been to before. It was supposed to be pretty secluded, not too far from where I lived, but far enough that it wasn't overrun with people. The trail was about an hour and a half drive from my place, out in this more remote area that I hadn't explored much. I remember waking up early that morning, packing my backpack with the usual stuff: water, snacks, a map, my phone, and a small first aid kit, and heading out just as the sun was coming up. The drive out there was peaceful, just me and the open road, and I was really looking forward to some quiet time on the trail. When I got to the trailhead, it was exactly what I was hoping for: completely deserted. There were no other cars in the small dirt parking lot, and the air was crisp and cool. Perfect hiking weather. I parked my car, grabbed my backpack, and set off down the trail, feeling pretty good about the day ahead. The first part of the hike was beautiful. The trail wound through dense forest, with tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, creating this cool, shaded path. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional chirping of birds. It was the kind of quiet that's almost eerie, but also calming at the same time. I hadn't felt this relaxed in weeks. After about an hour of hiking, the trail started to get steeper, leading up towards a ridge. I was in decent shape, but the incline was a bit more challenging than I expected. Still, I was enjoying the workout, pushing myself to see how far I could go. I had my phone with me, but there wasn't much reception out there, so I didn't bother checking it. I was more focused on the trail ahead and the trees around me. Eventually, I reached a small plateau where the trail leveled out. There was a clearing up ahead with a few large rocks that looked like a good spot to take a break. I made my way over, sat down on one of the rocks, and pulled out my water bottle. The view was incredible. Rolling hills and dense forest as far as the eye could see. I felt like I was the only person in the world. But as I sat there, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, but the feeling only got stronger. It was like the air around me had changed, gotten heavier somehow, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I looked around the clearing, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the trees swaying slightly in the breeze, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see someone or something watching me. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the trees behind me. It wasn't loud, just enough to catch my attention. I froze, my heart starting to race as I listened. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was dead silent. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a squirrel or a bird, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I stood up slowly, trying to keep calm, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking back towards the trail. I kept my pace steady, not wanting to look like I was panicking, but inside, I was freaking out. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see what might be behind me. As I walked, the rustling started again, this time closer. It was like something was moving through the trees, following me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the adrenaline kicking in, that fight or flight response taking over. I wasn't sure what was out there, but I knew I didn't want to stick around to find out. The trail felt longer on the way back, like it was stretching out in front of me. Every sound, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that I was going to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing, just the same dense forest and that oppressive silence. Finally, after what felt like forever, I reached the parking lot. My car was still the only one there, and I practically ran to it. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door and got inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I sat there for a minute, just listening to the sound of the engine idling, trying to convince myself that I was safe now. But that feeling of unease wouldn't go away. It was like I could still feel eyes on me, like whatever had been out there was still watching. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed back down the road, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, even though I knew it was probably just my imagination. The drive home was a blur. I was so focused on putting as much distance between me and that trail as possible. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, something I don't normally do in the middle of the day. I tried to go about my usual routine, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The rational part of my brain kept telling me it was nothing, just a bad case of nerves, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something had been out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. A few days later, I mentioned the hike to a friend of mine who's also into hiking. I didn't tell him about the weird feeling I'd had or the rustling in the trees, just that I'd checked out a new trail. He gave me this look and asked if it was the trail near the old logging road. When I said yes, he told me that there had been some strange stories about that area. People hearing noises, seeing things that didn't make sense. He even mentioned a few hikers who had gone missing over the years, though nothing had ever been proven. Hearing that only made me feel worse. It wasn't just my imagination. Other people had felt something too. I started to wonder if maybe I'd been lucky to get out of there when I did. Maybe whatever was out there had decided to let me go. Or maybe it was just waiting for the next hiker to come along. I haven't been back to that trail since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. There's just something about it that doesn't sit right with me. Something that makes me feel like it's better to stay away. I still go hiking, but I'm a lot more careful about where I go now, and I always make sure to tell someone where I'm going and when I'll be back. It's funny. Hiking used to be the thing that made me feel safest, the one place where I could really relax. But after that day, it's never been the same. There's always that little voice in the back of my head reminding me that the woods aren't as empty as they seem, that sometimes there's something out there that you can't see until it's too late. So yeah, that's my story. It's not the kind of thing that's easy to forget, and even now, I still think about it whenever I'm out on the trails. It's a reminder that nature isn't just beautiful and peaceful, it can also be terrifying in ways you don't expect. And sometimes, it's the things you can't see that are the scariest of all.